All right, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. I'll start off with a question. How many of you here actually have ever had or like sugarcane juice? I know, odd question. Good. Well, where I'm going with this, growing up in India in the hot summer months, it was a fairly common sight to find these large sugarcane pressing machines at every street corner. And I know when they put the cane through the machine, the juice will come out, but they won't throw away the cane. They will twist it, they will fold it, and they'll put it through the machine again, and again, and again. And that's what you might feel, because I know it's the last day of the session, probably the last hour as well. But stick with us. We'll try and make this fun and entertaining as much as possible. I know it's a little bit of a dry topic, but we'll do our best. Welcome to this 60-minute session on Tableau's SAML integration. We will cover some of the highlights using slides, but we'll also show a demo towards the very end. We've structured this to be a 45-minute session through the slides and the demo, and we'll have 15 minutes towards the end for any Q&A as well. If possible, let's hold the questions towards the very end. My name is Abhishek Singh, and I lead the professional services delivery team for Tableau. I've been with Tableau for 5 years and started off as an architect myself. We have a global team of architects and consultants and trainers that work with large enterprises on a regular basis. And speaking of global, on a personal note, most members in my family are from a different part of the world, so I had to include a Viz. Joining me in today's talk is my friend Grant.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grant Heaton, and I'm a delivery manager with Tableau. I've been with Tableau for about 2 years, but I've also been on the other side of the table in IT, where I managed a center of excellence and had to do things like implement single sign-on and so forth for my customer. In my personal time, I love to travel. I've been to about 50 countries so far, and this year I got blessed to be able to go to Stonehenge. And an interesting fact about Stonehenge is that one of the reasons the monument has endured 5,000 years of English reign is because it's made out of the hardest stone known in the United Kingdom. And the ancients must have known this too, because they had to carve these stones and drag them 180 miles across Wales to build this monument. So I found that really fascinating that they built it with the intention to have it last for all time. So I have a question for everyone before we get started. By show of hands, how many of you use a simple password that somebody might be able to guess? And maybe you don't want to admit it, but that's great. Everyone's using complex passwords. But by chance, do you use the same password across multiple sites? I'm guilty of that too in some cases. Oops, something happened there. Slide deck jumped ahead. So have you ever been a little bit worried about what might happen if one of those sites had insufficient security and the password got compromised? The purpose of SAML is to help protect you by using one authentication system that's robust and used across applications so that users don't have to keep re-entering their passwords. So it saves them time and it makes apps more secure. So we'll talk through what SAML is today and how to configure it with Tableau Server. And Abhishek will also be giving us a demonstration of configuring SAML both for Tableau Online as well as a Tableau on-premise environment. Let's start off with a Dilbert cartoon here. This is about information security. And what this cartoon speaks to is that the paradox of security is this. The business and the users both want security, but they want it to be invisible. And this is really difficult to balance the two needs, wanting something to be transparent and easy to use, but also at the same time secure. And this is effectively what single sign-on is accomplishing, and also SAML. So SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. Let's break down what each of these terms mean. So by security, what we're talking about here is that security is about providing authentication to Tableau Server. So our use of SAML is about authenticating who you are, much like the bouncer at the door to a club. We're just checking your ID to make sure that you're authorized into the system. What SAML doesn't do is provide authorization or permissions within Tableau Server. Those are always handled within Tableau. So that's the security piece. Assertion means that we're no longer directly authenticating in Tableau. What we're doing is setting up a trust relationship so that Tableau is delegating that authentication out to a trusted identity provider. And that identity provider is the one that handles the authentication. And then Tableau trusts the assertion that that authentication is valid. Markup language refers to how the conversation is handled between components. And this actually occurs with XML markup language. And the crux of it is this, that SAML is an industry-accepted authentication standard that's secure, that can be used across applications, and just enables us to have one identity store for handling access to apps. So why do organizations choose SAML? Well, there are a few reasons. One is standardization, and what that means is that we eliminate the need for storing multiple passwords. Security, because apps don't need to store their own entitlement system or their own passwords, the opportunity for identity theft and phishing is drastically reduced. The user experience is also a lot better because users can do single sign-on, and it's also IT friendly, so there's less calls for password resets, forgotten passwords, and account lockouts, and so forth. Some of the terminology we'll be going over today are things like client. So when we talk about client, we're talking about a user accessing a secure resource, in this case, any Tableau server user. A service provider is the web server that the user is accessing. In this case, it's going to be Tableau Server, and more specifically, like the Tableau Server Gateway and Application Server. Identity provider refers to the SAML provider that you've chosen to configure. In this case, it could be Okta, OneLogin, Ping Identity, or others. All right, let's talk through how SAML works. So there's two flavors of SAML. The first one we'll walk through is Service Provider Initiated SAML. So in the first step, the user is going to navigate to the Tableau Server sign-on page or get a link to a published workbook, and then they're going to be challenged to enter their username. Now, there's a little asterisk next to this, and what that's referring to is that the username is only asked for when we're using site-specific SAML. When we're using server-wide SAML, we don't need to enter in the username. It's assumed automatically because we only have one SAML provider configured. The next step is Tableau starts the authentication process, and it contacts the registered IDP, and it redirects the user to that IDP. The IDP requests the user's password, and after confirming that the username submitted is identical to what's in the identity store, or the IDP assertions, it authenticates that user. Next, the IDP is going to return a success response back to Tableau Server, and the user is logged on to Tableau Server and granted a Tableau session. At this point, Tableau can then display the page the user requested in the initial login screen, which could be the Tableau landing page or perhaps the document that they requested in the case of a shared document link. The other flavor of SAML is Identity Provider Initiated SAML. And what you see here is an IDP portal. In this case, it is Okta. In IDP initiated SAML, the user is going to navigate to their portal and log into their portal where authorized applications are going to be listed. In this case, you see Tableau Server listed as an authorized application. The user is going to click on the link to go to the application. At that point, a SAML assertion is triggered, and then that's transported to Tableau using an HTTP post binding method. An access check is then made to verify that the user has the correct authorizations to access the resource requested. And then if that access check succeeds, the requested page is displayed, in this case, the Tableau login page. There are a few things that SAML doesn't do, and some of those things are content permissions. As I mentioned, permissioning is always handled in Tableau Server. It doesn't do license provisioning either. You're also going to do your license provisioning in Tableau Server. It's just authentication. Now, SAML supports different identity stores depending on how you've configured it. This is a nice matrix that I like to use to help explain all the different authentication types and what identity stores they support. And in particular, for our topic today, that orange box covers server-wide SAML and site-specific SAML and indicates what types of identity stores are supported with each. And we'll go through that in a little more detail in a second. This other graph or matrix shows all the Tableau tools on the left-hand side, as well as what authentication mechanisms they each support. And the only thing is tab command doesn't support SAML. You'll have to use a manual logon with that. Okay, so you've got 3 deployment options for SAML. First, you could choose to deploy server-wide SAML that will be used on all Tableau sites. And what this means is that everyone who is a Tableau server user is going to use the same SAML provider to log into Tableau server. Excuse me. Alternatively, you could deploy server-side local identity store plus site-specific SAML, which enables different sites to each have their own service provider. And this is a great option to use if you are say, running Tableau Server as a service provider with different sub-companies who might each have their own SAML login provider. And your last option is you could deploy server-wide SAML plus site-specific SAML using potentially a different service provider than the server for each of those sites. And again, that's a good option if you've got different sub-companies that you're providing access to. Let's talk through each of those options in a little more detail. So the first option is server-wide SAML authentication. Here, the Tableau server can use local identity store or LDAP or Active Directory, and all users of all sites use that one SAML provider, in this case, one login as indicated on that slide. The next option is that you would use server-wide local identity store and site-specific SAML authentication. And what this means is that you would use the local identity store, or otherwise known as local authentication, on the server, and each site could use their own identity provider, in this case, Okta and Ping Identity. And the third option is server-wide SAML authentication and site-specific SAML authentication. So just like before, we can have a local identity store on the server, but also a server SAML provider configured, in this case, one login, and then each site can use its own SAML provider. There are some compatibility requirements to keep in mind. One is that we don't support Kerberos with SAML. There's no mutual SSL. And to connect to a site SAML or site-specific SAML-enabled Tableau server, you've got to use Tableau Desktop 10 or greater. All right, I'll go ahead and turn things back over to Abhishek, who's going to demonstrate how to configure SAML with both Tableau Online and an on-premise server.
All right, thanks, Grant. Demos are always a little bit tricky. We have backup slides just in case. I'm going to stop this, and like Grant mentioned, first we'll cover the Tableau Online configuration as it relates to Okta. So I'm going to show 2 applications. One, I will show Tableau Online. We'll make some configuration changes there. And then I will show Okta as well, and there'll be some configuration settings required there. And once everything is set up, I will try to log in on Tableau Online, and I should be redirected to Okta for login. So this is a Tableau Online demo site that I have access to. If you are an admin on Tableau Online, you will have access to settings. Let's go in here. There is the Authentication tab. All right. So we have access to a Tableau Online site. If you are an admin, you will have the option to configure settings. So we'll go in the settings option here. And then we have the Authentication tab. So let's go in here. And then in the Authentication tab, by default, Tableau stores the username and password in online. So your authentication method by default is set to Tableau. You can enable SAML as well. So that's what we're going to choose here. I already have it pre-configured, so it's already selected here. You can click on Edit Connections, and that's where you provide additional details on the configuration. So let's click on Edit Connection here. And then we have step-by-step instructions on how to exchange metadata from Tableau Online to Okta. So whenever you set up SAML integration, there's going to be an exchange of metadata first between the two systems. So in our case, there's going to be some information you need from Tableau Online to Okta, and vice versa as well. The very first one is exporting some metadata from Tableau Online, and that's essentially the online entity ID and the assertion consumer service URL. So we have these two settings that we have to upload in Okta as well. Let's go ahead and flip the control over to Okta, where I can actually show where to make changes. So this is my Okta login. I'm already an admin in Okta, so this is what the page looks like. I'm in the Applications tab here, where I have a listing of all the applications that I've configured. When you're starting off, you can just add applications through this button here. So if you click on this, you can search for Tableau applications here, and you will find the online and server applications already here set up. So since I've already added, let's go back to Tableau Online. And we'll go in the Sign On tab, and we will edit. So remember, there were two key things that we selected from the Tableau Online settings. That was the ACS URL and the Tableau Server Entity ID. These are the places where you will actually upload those two settings. Once that is done, we can flip back into Tableau Online, because you've already completed step 1, and you've already completed step 2. Step 3 is you can export metadata from your IDP, in our case Okta, and import that into Tableau Online. So for that, we'll flip back again in Okta, and there is a hyperlink here, Identity Provider Metadata. You just click on this, and you will get some metadata information in an XML format that you can just right-click and save as on a local file. Key things here are there is a X509 certificate, which is included here. This certificate is actually used for authentication. And when we talk about Tableau Server Okta authentication, I'll give some more details on this one. The other important one is HTTP post binding. So like Grant mentioned during his slides, HTTP post is what is supported. So that should always be there. Once you have this metadata, we can go back into Tableau Online and upload those settings here. So I've already done that. Once done, you can test the connection just to make sure everything works fine. And I'm already signed in. It gives me an indication that the authentication response was received. There's an assertion mappings section, so let me close this. When you're exchanging information between two systems, they may have different names for attributes, right? So you may have a different first name or an email address. So this is the section where you can make some of those changes if the assertions have different names in different applications. In our case, we can just keep it as default because that's how they are. The next one is if you have a scenario where you have a web page where you are embedding Tableau Online views, you can set up the embedding to be in a separate pop-up window, which is recommended, or you can use in-frame or inline as well. And there are some issues, security issues, if you use inline iframe embedding, but it is certainly possible to do it using the setting here. If you run into any challenges with the setting up the configuration and you're trying to troubleshoot, you can definitely reach out to support, but you also have access to the log file itself, which is pretty detailed. I would encourage taking a look at this in case you run into any issues. Once these settings are done, you can manage users. So you can specify, because if you remember on the top, we had the ability to choose Tableau authentication or SAML authentication. This is where I can specify which users are going to be authenticated using SAML or Okta in our case, versus just Tableau authentication. I'll talk about the SCIM settings in a bit, but we are done with the authentication configurations here. So let's go back into Okta. The only additional piece here, which I missed out, was you can actually go into the Assignments tab. And this is where you will configure the list of users that you want to have access to the Tableau Online application. So you can go ahead and add folks here in the setting here. Now, with this done, let's go ahead and try and log in as a user that is configured to use SAML for Tableau Online. So I'm going to start a new browser window here. And I will try to log in on Tableau Online. So even though I entered the Tableau Online ID, I should be redirected to Okta for authentication. So I have a user ID already configured, and the moment I enter the email address, Tableau Online knew that this user is configured to use SAML. So it automatically removed the password option here. So I click on sign in here, and I'm redirected to Okta for login. So I can provide my credentials here. And it takes me straight back to Tableau. So this is the online configurations for Tableau Online. The other thing I wanted to show, which I briefly touched upon, was the skim settings. So there is a way to configure Okta to automatically onboard users within Tableau itself. Now, this functionality is only available in Tableau Online. Again, fairly easy to set up. You just enable this checkbox, and you will get a skim base URL, and you will get a secret key. Now you can go back into Okta, and in Tableau Online application, you have a provisioning tab here, and you have integration settings here, and that's where you can specify enable API integration and provide your base URL and the API token. After that, since Okta is providing information to Tableau Online, you can enable the options to create users, update user attributes, and deactivate users. Let's actually see this in action. What we'll do is we'll go into assignments, and we'll try and add a user that doesn't exist. So let's assign to people. And I'll add April in the link here. And let's just make sure April doesn't exist in Tableau Online. So we'll go into Online, we'll go into the Users tab, and we don't have April here. Let's get back into Okta, and I can assign April, and I can configure her to be, let's say, a site admin creator. And I do save and go back, and I'm all done here. So April is added on the application within Okta itself. I go back to site users here, and I just refresh. And I will see that April is already created here. So it's a very real-time sync between the two systems. And like I said, this support is only available in Tableau Online. It works both ways as well, in the sense you could actually just disable this user completely, and that would actually remove the user's access from Tableau Online as well. So let's go back here, and if I refresh it, April becomes unlicensed, right? So that's about Tableau Online configuration. Fairly easy to do. There's no installation, exchange of certificates. None of that is involved. But let's take a look at Tableau Server as well. So for that, what we will do is I have a Tableau Server already configured. This is the Tableau Services Manager screen, and it's a single node. Let's go into the configuration tab here. We'll go into User Identity and Access, and we'll go into the Authentication Methods tab here. And if you recall, Grant mentioned you cannot have competing authentication methods on Tableau Server. So if you choose SAML, you cannot have Kerberos or mutual SSL. So we already have SAML configured here. I have a single site, so I don't have the option to set up site-specific SAML here. But you can enable server-wide SAML for the entire Tableau server here. You can provide, just like in online, it's step-by-step instructions, fairly clear here. You can specify the Tableau server return URL, a SAML entity ID, which is unique. You can provide a cert and a key file. A lot of customers actually reuse their SSL cert and key. My suggestion, if you're using that, is to remove the passphrase from the key file. Again, this is documented as well. And then once you have all of this information set up here, you can download a metadata file from Tableau and import it into your IDP. Now, Okta doesn't really allow you to import metadata files. So you can skip steps 2 and 3. Let's go back into Okta. And again, we're talking about Tableau Server. So I already have that application set up here. So let's go ahead, click Edit. We'll go into the sign-in. When you're setting this up, the login URL, SAML entity ID that we saw actually go here. We have the same way to export metadata that we did for online. So you can click on this, it'll give you the metadata information. You can also enable single logout. So you just have to check this box and provide the certificate you're already using on Tableau Server. Let's take a look at the metadata on coming in from Okta here. This is slightly different than what we saw in the past because we have the certificate file information. We have the HTTP post binding for single sign-on, but we also have HTTP post binding for single logout. So if you ever have a situation where you enable SAML and you don't see a logout button on Tableau Server, it's because your metadata is actually missing the HTTP post binding for the single logout metadata. So this is the key here. Once you have this, you can go back into the Tableau Server, and you can upload the file here. And just like in online, there's going to be an exchange of information, so we can make sure that the attributes of the identity actually match. In our case, we'll just stick with the defaults here. You also have the option to specify if you want to use SAML for Tableau Desktop, Tableau Mobile, and if you want to enable single sign-out as well. Once you've configured all these changes here, you can restart Tableau Server, and you are pretty much done. Let's go ahead and test this as well. So I'll try and log in on Tableau Server. And the login itself redirected me straight to Okta. And once the authentication is done, the control goes back, redirects straight to Tableau itself. And again, the other thing I was mentioning is you do have the option to sign out if you have that metadata in the Okta file. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we have covered configuration settings in Tableau Online, configuration settings in Okta, configuration settings for Tableau Server. Let's take a look at one last thing. Now, since we don't have the skim functionality in Tableau Server right now, it's something which is on the roadmap and it's being worked through and prioritized. But in case you're in a situation where you want to automate that functionality right now, there are plenty of documentation, APIs available both from Tableau Server and from Okta as well that you can leverage. So if you were to do something like that, let's just show that flow as well. So I'm going to go back in the slide. These are my backup slides in case the demo didn't work, so we can skim through these. So if you were to do user and group synchronization workflow, a typical workflow may look like this. So you may have an Okta admin, may or may not be the same as the Tableau admin as well. But essentially, the Okta admin would be provisioning users directly in Okta, right? And they could be provisioning users or groups. You could potentially write a script that reads Okta for new users or modified users or users that have been removed. It has a configuration file that it taps into that has things like login, URLs, and so on and so forth. And this could be a simple Python script that leverages APIs from Okta to read all that information and uses Tableau's REST APIs to, again, add and remove users and groups in Tableau Server. If group names are different in Okta and Tableau Server, you could have a separate mapping file that stores that configuration as well. Now, you don't have to do it if group names are exactly the same. But potentially, you could script something like this. Let's take a look at some of the APIs that might actually be helpful. So on the Okta side, we have list applications. These are, again, REST APIs. You have list groups assigned to application, which gives you a listing of all the groups, which is a collection of users for a given application. You can also list group members. So this is a list of all the users within a group. And since we are reading from Okta, all these are list. And since we are writing into Tableau, it's all create or add or remove. So you have create groups, add users to site, add users to group, remove users from group. There is plenty of documentation on both Okta APIs as well as Tableau's REST APIs as well. Has anyone here used Postman at all? Perfect. So wonderful application for testing REST APIs without having to write a ton of code. So I already have the collection imported from Okta, and happy to show that. So like I said, Okta already has a collection. The three main APIs that might be helpful is list applications. So I already have the API, the URL, everything configured here. If I invoke this API against Okta, I get a JSON file that gives me a listing of different attributes. But essentially, it's a list of all the applications. In our case, it was Tableau Server and Tableau Online. The other one I mentioned was list groups assigned to an application. So if I have an application ID, which I got from my previous call, I could get a listing of all the groups assigned to that application as well. So if I invoke that, I will get a listing of all the groups. I have only one group, so that's the only one that comes up. And the last one is list group members. So once I have a group ID, I could put that in the REST call as well, and I will get a listing of all the users within that group. But yeah, these are the three key APIs that I would encourage you just taking a look at those. Troubleshooting tips and tricks. So Okta has a developer functionality as well, so you can sign up for a developer account. I'd encourage doing that, so you can at least test out how this actually works in your environment. I will show SAML Tracer as well. I think it's pretty helpful, and we have a few minutes, which allows you to trap the XML that is being passed between Tableau and Okta, and you can troubleshoot from there as well. You can also enable log level debugging for WG server on Tableau server if you have, and you can use tab admin or TSM commands depending on what version you're on. Just keep in mind that once you're done with the debugging, do disable the logging as well. Revert it back. Otherwise, the log file continues to grow. Username attribute could be missing. So we talked about matching the attributes between the two systems. That's something to keep in mind if username is configured as a different attribute name in Okta. All the assertions that are passed are timestamped as well. So if clocks are not synchronized in the systems, your assertions may fail. Assertions need to be signed as well. And we already talked about using HTTP post, not HTTP redirect. Here are some helpful resources. I talked about the Tableau Online Help Guide for Okta, setting up an online, Tableau Server, REST APIs from Okta, REST APIs from Tableau, and some troubleshooting tips and tricks. There is one more thing I would like to show. So I was talking about SAML Tracer. What you can do with that is I have Firefox open here. And there is an extension you can add on Firefox. It's actually there on most browsers, even on Edge and Chrome as well. But I already have it installed on Firefox. If I enable the SAML Tracer, I will be able to track the XML being passed between different systems. So let's go ahead and log in on Tableau Server. And I'm redirected to Okta for login. And once the login is done, I have a bunch of messages here. Let's select one of these. And I can take a look at the SAML response that was sent. And if I scroll all the way down, there's a lot of certificate information, a lot of URLs. But in the very end, I should see an attribute called username, which is this one, along with the value of that attribute that was being passed. So if you're setting it up and you get an error which says username not found, you could basically use a SAML tracer and see what username was actually being passed. You could get to these from Tableau logs as well, but I think it's fairly helpful to use SAML tracer for debugging as well. Right. I think that's all we have from a demo perspective as well. We will open the floor for any questions you may have. But before you leave, just a gentle reminder, if you have attended any of the other sessions as well as this one, please feel free to provide some evaluation so we can improve our presentation and content for the next conference. With that, any questions?